Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a fish out of water podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 157, Films of Fairy 5, Fairy Tales in the Modern Day.
More fairy tales. In fact, the conclusion of the fairy tale series.
Yeah, we've gone through a lot, and now the fairy tales are breaking in to the everyday, to our modern world, which is kind of a break in the rules. If you'll remember some of the things we were talking about, again, this whole series is kind of being guided by Tolkien's On Fairy Stories essay, which will be linked in the blog post. But he does kind of address this type of fantasy that is incorporated into the modern world. And it goes along with this idea of recovery. And so of the four qualities of fantasy that we've already covered, there was escape, consolation, which was the eucatastrophe, the fantasy, the magic, imaginative element, and then recovery is the last one, or the last one that we're covering in the way that we have structured this. And the idea with recovery and fairy stories and these magical mythical stories is basically looking at the real world, but from a new angle. And Tolkien talks about how every fairy tale does this. Like the most essential elements of fairy tales are still real life elements that don't actually have that much magic in them, but they just have to, like, we have to find ways to look at the world around us with fresh eyes. And so you can see this a lot in Tolkien's writing, because Tolkien was so influenced by nature. And so sometimes it's people who don't prefer that style will use it as a criticism, but Tolkien spends a lot of time describing trees and hills and rocks and just the nature in his stories. And none of that is fantasy. That's all stuff pulled directly from the real world, but in a way that helps us look at it with fresh eyes and kind of even in certain personifications, like if you look at Treebeard, it gives a voice to those elements of the real world and helps us imagine interacting with them in new ways. So that's in Tolkien's pure fantasy, but there's also what he kind of describes as Chestertonian fantasy, which is a little bit of a misnomer. But he says G.K. Chesterton, who was also a fantasy writer, who influenced a lot of the writers in Tolkien's era. I think they were contemporary. I'm not sure how far before Tolkien Chesterton was. But Chesterton talks about the idea of Moorefok, which is spelled
Gesundheit.
Mooreffoc. So it looks like a really alien word. It's like a foreign alien land. But Chesterton writes about this as a way of looking at the real world from a new lens, because he pulls it from, this is from a book that Chesterton wrote about Charles Dickens, where Dickens talks about the world of Moorefok, but Moorefok can be found all throughout London, less so in America. But really what it is it's the word coffee room seen through a mirror. And so the word is reversed and it kind of turns into this whole new thing. And especially for Tolkien, who says that words evoke worlds, basically, for him. So like the beginning of The Hobbit, where he was grading papers one day, he flipped over a sheet of paper and wrote, "In a hole in the ground there lives a hobbit." And as someone so involved in the world of words, just the word hobbit kind of evoked the entire Shire, and then it invokes Middle Earth. Stuff that he had already been working on, but certain words can give a new, fresh perspective on those kinds of things. And so the way Chesterton talks about Moorefok is just looking at the real world from a new lens and finding this kind of mythical, magical, awe-inspiring, wonder-inspiring element in it. And Tolkien talks about this kind of fantasy that is in the real world, but, where the fantasy and the real world intersect, as kind of limited in terms of its fantasy application, But this idea of recovery is one of the things that it's best at doing, because it directly encounters the real world with this fantastical element. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about films that do that. And I think what we're going to find, at least what I've kind of been noticing, is that film in particular is really good at this type of fantasy. One thing that I mentioned in the very first episode of the series is that Tolkien was not a fan of dramatized fantasy. Once you see the fantasy in front of you, again, I mentioned that Tolkien has this kind of even aversion to seeing the witches from Macbeth. He feels like the witches are best played in literature or even the oral tradition because there's more imagination involved in those mediums. But with film, which is a direct representation, I think it's really good at doing this type of fantasy where most of the story is set in the real world, and then where the fantasy intersects becomes more poignant because of that direct representation of the real world through film. And I think that the films that I tried to choose they have varying degrees of subtlety in the way that they do this, because a lot of times, sometimes you have to be careful in the way that you do this, depending on what you want the effect to be. So we have films that are hyper fantasy, and we have films that are very, the fantasy is kind of underlaid. There's magic in the film, but it's almost implied. It's almost just in the background of the more or less unfantastical stories that are going on. And they're also all based on pretty traditional fairy tales, and there's some crossover in the stories, as we will talk about. But, Alex, will you set up what the stories that we are talking about today are?
Certainly. We are going to be starting off with The Red Shoes from 1948, directed by the Archers, who we've done a podcast on before, Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, written by Powell and Pressburger, inspired by The Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen, starring Moira Searer, Adton Walbrook, and Marius Goring. Cinematography by Jack Cardiff, and music by Brian Easdale. I guess it's the Hans Christian Andersen episode, isn't it? Because next we'll be talking about Ponyo from 2008, directed by Hayao Miyazaki, written also by Miyazaki, and inspired by The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen, starring Yuria Nara, Hiroki Doi, Tomoko Yamaguchi, and George Tokoro.
It's also partially inspired by Wagner's Ring Cycle, specifically Die Valkyrie.
Ah, there you go. Die Valkyrie. Cinematography by Atsushi Okui, and music by Joe Hisaishi. And then finally, we'll be talking about Undine from 2020, directed by Christian Petzold, written by Christian Petzold, and inspired by Undine by Friedrich de la Motte Foch, starring Paula Beer and Franz Rogowski, and cinematography by Hans Fromm.
And I think last time I said that Undine was we're gonna pronounce it every single way, but in the film they pronounce it Undine. But I think I said it was French, and I apologize because it's a very, very German film, and it's from a very, very German story. So, with that apology made, Jason, set up The Red Shoes for us from 1948.
The Red Shoes from 1948. When his lead dancer quits an active ballet production to get married, the company director, Boris Limontoff, enlists an up-and-coming dancer and composer to create a new ballet based on Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Red Shoes, about a young girl who dances in her beautiful red shoes. But when she wants to stop, the shoes continue dancing. Both Victoria, the ballerina, and Julian, the composer, prove to be world-class talents, and the show is a hit. During the run of the show, Vicky and Julian fall in love, which compels Limontoff to fire Julian and in turn prompts Vicky to quit. After Julian and Vicky get married, Vicky takes a break from high-profile dancing so that Julian can further his composing career. Meanwhile, Limontoff refuses to perform The Red Shoes with any other dancer. But when he catches up with Vicky and gives her the opportunity to perform as a world-class ballerina once more, she must finally decide where her allegiance truly lies, in her heart or in the red shoes.
All right, Alex. So I think with each of these I am interested in the kind of the reasons to incorporate the fantasy element, because a lot of these stories could be just straight drama films or straight, I guess drama in the most broad sense of, it's just a straight story. Not that it's, Oscar bait or anything. But the element of magic usually is making a statement in these kinds of films. And in The Red Shoes, I think there's this idea of the magic as a mirror. So the story is a very meta story coming from the Archers, who are hyper artistic, hyper dramatic types of directors and creators. And so in this story, which is about a really heightened form of art in ballet and heightenedly abstract to some degree, because the actors in the film, specifically Moira Shearer, was a professional ballerina and not an actress. And so they took a lot of time to get actors who, or at least train professional dancers to act and be in the film. But it's a film about art as this obsessive and consuming pursuit. And you can see that as a, it's a meta element for, again, these directors who are very consumed with their art, which you can see in the insane amounts of detail and quality and craft that goes into every one of their films, because we've covered several of them on the show, and each one of them is just so precisely crafted that it's crazy. And so I think The Red Shoes is probably one of the most personal types of stories to make for them.
It works well because the world of performance, and especially the world of like theater, is one that is very much one of fantasy, not just the fantasy being put on stage, but kind of life outside of, even off stage, kind of becomes very unreal in a lot of ways. And we see that over the course of this film, which makes it very, very possible to integrate fairy tale elements into it. Because the actors are already the actors and the dancers and the composers are already kind of existing in this world of unreality, because it's a world of creativity where you can kind of make reality. So they're already unmoored from the shores of reality, which is well kitted and suited to a fairy tale story, where the world building isn't set up as being super firm, as like a full fantasy, but you kind of get those fantasy elements in there. And when something surreal happens, it kind of fits because we're already in this world of unreality, which works for The Red Shoes.
And really, the film has very little explicitly surreal elements. There's a climax at the end, but throughout the film, it's mostly just the Archer style that conveys a lot of the fantasy. Like pretty much, I feel like every Archer's film that we've watched has this just feeling of fantasy, even though they're all very, all their films are set in pretty much the real world. They just feel like fantasy because of that, again, attention to detail, but also it's an attention to detail that's almost akin to animation, which is something we'll talk about in the next film, in that everything has been so specifically placed that it feels like it can't be as random or spontaneous as real life. Like everything has to be there for a reason.
The real world isn't designed to that kind of tea.
Yeah.
Not in the same way that you see in an animated movie or an Archer's movie.
Yeah. And then you have the actual ballet sequence, where we get an extended sequence of watching the Red Shoes ballet. And it's a really incredible mix of ballet and film, in that you have these professional dancers doing this really intricate performance that even people who are not well versed in ballet can appreciate. But then it doesn't limit itself to the bounds of a stage like a normal ballet would. And so you have cutscenes and you have visual effects, you have compositing effects, you have like flying on wires and changing sets in otherwise impossible ways. And so you get this really beautiful blend and mixing of mediums that, again, through the abstract interpretations of ballet, just feels like fantasy, but not in a way that could not be done in the real world, or more or less done actually on a stage while watching a ballet.
Yeah, right. Because they're really crossing the line between what's actually being presented to the audience in the theater and what's being presented to the audience in the movie theater, if that makes sense, right? With the placement of the camera and where could it be viewed? Like some of the scenes in the ballet, which is a huge chunk of the film, really, are.
It's like how you forget actually, how big the gotta dance sequence is in Singing in the Rain.
Yeah.
It's like that.
It's like, oh, some of this makes sense from a stage perspective. Some of this could work, but a lot of it couldn't from a stage perspective. Like it's too tiny, or the angles aren't right, or something like that. Or some moments that rely on close up. Obviously, you wouldn't get the same effect in on stage.
There's some visual effects where she's green screened on top of these abstract floating ribbons and stuff like that.
Yeah, let's see you do that on stage. It's your stage effects. I'll make that happen.
Something. But yeah, and the other thing about doing fairy tales that are set in the modern day is you have to either completely ignore the tradition of fairy tales that we do have, or you have to lean into it. And so in this film, you have them specifically referencing the red shoes. So the ballet is about the red shoes. They're talking about the Hans Christian Andersen story. And it's being done very intentionally as a thematic point with the overbearing director who is so distraught that his lead actor quit because of love, that he's like, I need to hammer home the point that dance is all that should consume your life. And so let's take this story that's about that, and we're going to make a play about it. And then if anyone double crosses me, I will, track them down and ruin their life.
Yeah. No, it's pretty intense. Yeah. He's like the Maleficent of the movie.
Yeah. But it's interesting too, in that he kind of doesn't represent the story right. So he tells Julian the story, the composer, when he has to go do the music for it. And he says, she wants to dance in her red shoes. And so she puts them on as she goes and dances. And when she gets tired, the shoes won't let her stop. And she just keeps dancing. She dances over hill and vale and sea and sky, and eventually dies, which is not completely true, because actually what happens is she comes to an executioner's house and says, hey, I can't stop dancing in these shoes. Could you just cut my feet off? And so he chops her feet off. But really the story is about vanity. And so the shoes were her pride and her vanity. And he cuts her feet off, and she learns humility through that. And so she kind of dies at the end. But it's very different than what this film is about. But it's taking that general story and then kind of also taking the point and crafting a new point from the story. So in that way, it's doing an adaptation that's pretty faithful, but also, again, like we've talked about with other films, it's using the elements of the fairy tale and then using that as a base point for your own commentary or your own perspective on similar themes.
Yeah. No, it's a good base for it. Let me ask you this: are there any parts of the original version that you would have liked to have seen incorporated into the Red Shoes that wasn't there?
There's not that much else to it. I think the main thing is the little girl. It's basically the elements that they left out is that it's very much based in a kind of Christian / Puritan type of a culture. So the girl gets the red shoes and she's super proud of them, excited to wear them. She wears them to church and shows them off, and everyone's looking at her and not paying attention. And so that's part of the vanity is her showing off her, beautiful shoes and showing off how beautifully she can dance in them.
She distracted them from church.
Yeah, exactly.
I see where the morality tale comes into it.
Yeah, so even better is at the end, after she gets her feet chopped off, she decides to go back to church and, repent and be a good girl. But every time she goes to the church, the red shoes come and dance in front of her, and she gets scared, and so she hobbles away. The executioner also makes her wooden feet, but she hobbles away.
How's she hobbling?
So she has wooden feet and her crutches. So she hobbles away, and she tries to go to the church a couple times, but the red shoes are always in front of her. And so then she just goes to her room and closes the door and just prays for forgiveness. And then her room transforms into the church, and she's like transported into the church service that she can hear across the courtyard. And they're like, "Oh, wow, so glad that you could join us." And she was like, "I tried, but the red shoes stopped me." And then she was so happy to be back in church that she died and her soul went up to heaven. That's the stuff that's the stuff that they didn't put in the movie, which is kind of understandable, but it's still, there's also a change in focus of the point. This one has a much more tragic ending, obviously, which feels more grim than Hans Christian Andersen.
Yeah, that tracks. Yeah,
Hans Christian Andersen was much more child focused than Grimm, which were much more academically like folk focused.
Yeah. Here's a question: the scene after, at the very end of the movie, she's supposed to be dead, right?
I think it was a little unclear.
Yeah, because that's my thing. Like, it looked like the doctor declared her dead, but she's still moving. So
yeah, she was. I didn't know if that was like she didn't do the performance quite right, and they just left it because it was good enough, or if it was supposed to be maybe she has a second chance. But yeah, they did say she was dead.
Because in the ballet too, like she like dies in the ballet, right? They're mourning
and then
her
they have a wake
or
or something. Yeah. Yeah, and then that's right. She's kind of haunting her own wake.
Yeah. I thought it might be something like that, but I couldn't be certain.
Maybe, but it's also, doesn't it just cut to black right after that? So there's not a lot of time for interpretation.
There's not really a big resolution. Kind of they make their point and they end the movie.
Yeah, I think it's mostly just the big picture. Although the ending does kind of, you kind of see it coming, but still, I feel like Julian has a big 180 at the end where he comes in his leather jacket and he's like, "Why'd you walk out on me? I would never walk out on you. I walked out on my own thing just for you, but now you're dead to me."
Right? It's really intense.
And up to that point, he's been, the most like gaga romantic lead. But you do get, it's so interesting how they kind of work that in, because you get the scenes of their marriage where, he's like sneaking out of the bed, like, implying that he's like cheating on her with his music, which is really the point of both of them, is that they're both torn in those two different, they're both torn between their love for each other and their love for the art. And then you get the sense that Julian was, when it comes down to it, he was true to her and she was true to the red shoes in her heart of hearts, is kind of what they're going for. In that way, it's kind of, there's a tradition in the film that kind of leads up to La La Land in a more modern adaptation.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, where people, that kind of like the question between it's a question of like career versus personal pursuits, but with the
career in a specifically artistic sense.
Yeah, with the artistic, within the artistic scope.
Because it's not really a Citizen Kane kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like this weird thing, like it is basically
maybe artists just romanticize their own obsessions. They romanticize their own obsessions more than business people's obsessions.
Yeah, like there seems to be something, at least in the popular imagination, that's ennobled about the concept of being devoted to like an artistic career. Like that's somehow more
the
noble
bleeding
and pure
poet
than
syndrome.
being devoted to a non-artistic career.
Yeah.
And I can see some logic to that, but at the end of the day, you are kind of like the idea at the end of the day is also one of like an imbalance of the things in one's life. And if one's life becomes all one thing, then it doesn't matter what that thing is. It is unbalanced, and that's not a healthy thing to do. But there is kind of this aura around artistic pursuits. I mean, heck, I've seen it in Hollywood firsthand, where it's like, oh, if you pursue this, that's a good thing to pursue, and you should devote yourself entirely to it and be willing to eschew other parts of your life for it, whether it be like a significant other or even like your own mental health, both of which are things we see in the Red Shoes. So yeah, it's kind of in that way, it's another tale as old as time.
Yeah.
So devoted to the theater that you can't you can't drop the act when you're not there.
Yeah, exactly. But again, it's that story. It's that hyper grand, love story between your heart and your art, and done with all the flair that the archers could possibly throw at it, which is a lot. They have a lot of flair. So very enjoyable. One of their best, I think, in my personal opinion.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's like probably one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic Archers films. It's the one that you always hear Scorsese mention.
Right.
Whenever he's recruiting for his film archive project.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I think that was that one of their first restorations.
Yeah,
I forgot that was like a hallmark of their foundation, basically. That film.
That was a big deal. It's kind of like the flagship project of the film archive project, from what I understand, at least.
It's kind of the perfect one too, because when you look at the before and afters, you're like, it would be tragic if that film lived on with that grimy green tint over the whole thing, just from being so improperly stored and copied.
Yes, yeah, it would not be good.
So
it's nice to have that back. Film archival, very important.
There you go. We haven't talked about that in a while, so good to bring that back up.
That's a good film for it. Good film to talk about from archival with.
All right, I think with that, let's move on to Ponyo from 2008. Jason, set it up.
Ponyo from 2008. Brunhilde, the magical goldfish daughter of the sea wizard Fujimoto, escapes her father one day to explore the ocean. After being trapped in a glass bottle, she is found by a young boy named Sasuke. When Sasuke breaks the jar to rescue her, he cuts his finger, and Brunhilde heals the wound by licking it. Fujimoto retrieves Brunhilde, but finds that she now wishes to be called Ponyo, and is beginning to grow feet and transform into a human. Ponyo escapes again, and returns to Sasuke, where she learns about human things like friendship and ramen. But soon the port town is overwhelmed by stormy weather, culminating in a tsunami as Fujimoto invokes the help of Ponyo's mother, the sea goddess Gran Mamare, to help retrieve her. As Ponyo and Sasuke set out to find Sasuke's mother, who they were separated from in the tsunami, Ponyo must decide whether to return to her father or give up her magic to remain human and stay with her friend, Sasuke.
Ponyo is a lot of fun. I really like
It's so
Ponyo.
much fun. I feel like the animators just had a blast on this film.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they just went wild. They were like, let's animate a bunch of liquid and squishy fish.
Yeah. And I think I haven't gone back through the oeuvre and evaluated this, but just scrolling through Wikipedia, there was a moment where Miyazaki was thinking that they needed to up their animation game just before they made this film. And so I think that there's a lot of really interesting techniques and illustration styles that they incorporate into Ponyo that are pretty unique from some of the earlier films. And it pays off because there's so much fun stuff built into into this film all the way through.
Yeah, no, it's just the story is honestly relatively simple, but the concept of a little magic goldfish that accidentally rips open the space-time continuum and the fabric of reality because she fell in love with a human boy provides for a lot of very fun animation opportunities.
Oh yeah. I love how big the story is and how small the representation is.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is something that Marvel could learn.
Like where you just get this small little corner of it.
Yeah, even oh gosh, this is not the place to start, but it's just so much fun. I mean, even just the fact that they're like unleashing prehistoric eras of creatures and creation upon the world, and no one mentions it. Like they're like pointing out, oh look, that's a super old fish from millions of years ago. That's cool. And then they just move on.
There's a lot of people in this movie, characters in this movie, who react to things by going, "Oh, that's neat," which is maybe the most surreal thing in the movie. Full of surreal things is how non-reactive most of the people are to the crazy crap that happens. But I guess it is kind of working in that realm of fairy tale unreality, so it fits. But it is weird. Like the fact that the kid doesn't react to it super strongly is fine, but the fact that the old ladies don't react to it super strongly is fine.
Which is great that they're the main portions of the film.
But the fact that the mom is so okay with it is the weirdest thing. Like
the mom has her own issues.
Character, but she's just chill with every weird thing that happens.
She is low key like crazy though, because her driving scenes on that
oh, she's a wild driver. Yeah.
She's nuts.
Or just the fact that like an underwater sea witch appears to her and is like, hey, the world's ending, but the only way to save it is if your little boy decides he loves my little goldfish baby forever. Yeah. You cool with that? And she's like, yeah, apparently. So that's weird. But it is a very charming movie, and it is relatively simple and like what's actually like important to the plot. It's kind of is set up in a lot of and this is true of a lot of Miyazaki movies. The actual plot itself relatively simple and straightforward, but there's just a lot of places to explore very fun, very creative animation. Like the point of a scene could be very simple, like, you know, I don't remember any names, but the underwater sea wizard who used to be human,
Fujimoto,
and is Ponyo's dad. He just there's a scene where he can't control her anymore. But in that scene, we get a bunch of really cool animation with the fish bubble, with squeezing Ponyo down, with her growing chicken feet and chicken legs.
It's so weird.
And his jars everywhere, the crabs coming in through the window. None of that other stuff is super duper important to the plot, but it just fleshes out the world and the idea of the fantasy really well by animating all this very specific stuff that's very fun to animate, even if it's not plot relevant. It's very exploratory in its design and its structure, and because of that, it kind of embraces this childlike sense of wonder and imagination and exploration that dovetails quite well with the sense of exploring fairy tales. I guess in a sense, instead of a deep dark wood, you have a deep dark sea. Except it's not very dark. Even it's full of light. You have a big bright sea.
Well, that's also thanks to Fujimoto. But yeah, I think that, especially when we're talking about form, and we've talked about a lot of different types of animation and ways of presenting films. And so we've talked about classic Disney 2D animation, we've talked about stop motion, we've talked about modern Disney 3D animation, modern DreamWorks 3D animation. We've even talked about in Maleficent with the modern CG chaos stuff. But Miyazaki and the Ghibli studio have done such a good job of creating this feeling of fantasy through their animations that I think is one of the best ways to translate fantasy onto film in a way that if and maybe possibly when some person decides to make a live action Ponyo, it's going to be a complete disaster. Because can you imagine watching the scene where Ponyo is riding the fish waves to catch up with Sasuke? And it's so fluid and integrated, and the timing on everything is so perfect in a way that I think is, and I know every time someone calls something unfilmable, someone tries to film it, but I truly think that this type of a film is unfilmable in live action.
Well, that's one of the things about live action adaptations and fantastic genres as a whole, is that when you do fantasy and animation, you can kind of do whatever you want. In whatever style you want. And if you try to adapt it to live action, inevitably what ends up happening, no matter how well you do it, is that you end up recreating the animation through a series of CGI. You're essentially just reanimating the whole movie again, but in a different style. It's like every single live action Disney adaptation is basically like, let's reanimate this, but with CGI. The farthest extent of that is probably like the Dumbo movie or the Lion King live action adaptation. So
basically, Disney has become a corporate Howard Hughes.
I mean, in a lot of ways, yeah.
Because we've talked about how Howard Hughes filmed, what was it, Hell's Angels or something? And then reshot it like 3 times before even releasing it because technology kept advancing and he was unsatisfied all of a sudden.
Yeah,
Disney
more or less.
is doing that, and just like, except they're releasing every single iteration of it.
Yeah. Like the modern Disney live action adaptations aren't even truly live action. They're just blended animation.
Yeah.
Like it's blended live action and animation.
They're all Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
But so much of it has to be animated. Through CGI. That
even stuff that would be filmable is
movie.
Just a green screen.
Yeah. I mean, heck, you could probably even say that about like superhero movies. So much of it is done in a computer, animated, that you're not even really shooting a live action movie anymore.
Yeah. And when they start just AIing their actors into it, it'll be completely animated.
Well, I think the newest contract forbids that. So
yeah.
I think
we'll
that's
see how long that
off.
lasts.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in the world of Ghibli, there's, I think, another thing about this type, especially this type of 2D animation, because, 2D animation scales from hyper impressionist to hyper realist, depending on how much time you're willing to throw at it. But in this type of stylized 2D animation, you still have an element of that imaginative quality. So in the sense that when you're watching live action, you're not really imagining anything, even if it's animated to look like live action, hyper realistic. You're still, the onus is not on you to imagine what this could look like in real life. With this type of 2D animation, it's a half step between your imagined view of what this story is looking like in the real world and what is being portrayed. So in that sense, I think, because in terms of Tolkien's criticism of fantasy done dramatically is, no matter how you try to portray the big bad wolf on stage, it's still either a dude in a wolf costume or it's like a bunch of metal bars in a wolf costume. But here it
way to bring Five Nights at Freddy's into this.
Oh gosh. But I think that this type of animation gives you a little bit of that outlet to still go a step further through imagining, translating the animated illustrations into your imagination, into your full experience of the story. So that's just a little form theory on this, but I think it's an important one because one of the things Tolkien also talks about is how like fairy tales and folklore is informed by the language that it's written in. And he kind of developed that theory through translating Beowulf and studying a lot of the Old English stories. And so I think that it's important to look at the language that's being used, even within the medium of film, different types of animations are almost different dialects when translating stories. And I think that they each present the story in a specific way, which again is another argument for not reinterpreting them as live action, because a lot of times these fairy tale stories are specifically built for a type of animation. They were not built to be live action stories. There's a different type of story and effect that comes across with live action stories. But we've beat that point to death, I think.
Yeah. You lose some of the fantasy by bringing it closer to reality.
Yeah. And there are ways to do it, but it's not a direct translation of one animated story into the modern world. But looking at films like The Red Shoes and even Undine, there are ways of adding fantasy to live action, but it's not this type of, like, Ponyo is the most overtly fantastic film that we're talking about right now, because it's the most explicit, because of that form that it takes, which allows so much more artistic freedom and artistic imagination to translate to the audience that live action does not afford.
Gosh, I just love how Japanese anime films just take a break from the plot for like 30 minutes to just do random crap, but it's all
anime.
like really fun random crap.
Yeah. Yeah, like in Ponyo, the ramen sequence, when the storm is coming and they're just hanging out at home, there's literally a catastrophic event happening, and they're gonna start the generator and make ramen. And it's wonderful. But that's also one of the things about Ponyo that is incredible for this idea of recovery, is especially using children as the protagonist and the main, and this fish out of water protagonist who's exploring the world.
I see what you did there.
Thank you. But you get this appreciation for things like ramen. Like ever since Taylor and I watched this for the first time, we're just like, we'll randomly shout, "I want ham!" Just like Ponyo's complete exuberance over the smallest things like ham and ramen, or whatever else is going on. Like, we actually did that. I think after we watched Ponyo or something, we watched another Japanese film, and we did fancy ramen. We added the egg and the ham and the
man, did you get a slice of that chasu pork in there? Oh man, that's some good stuff.
No, we have not done pork. We should do that. But
now, you have to make sure you use the technique from Tampopo to properly enjoy the ramen.
Stroke the pork, and you appreciate it, and you take your moment.
Taste the broth.
Taste the broth. But it does. It gives you this kind of renewed appreciation for one of the simplest things that, you could take ramen and make it in 3 minutes and eat it in 15 minutes. Or you can take a second and realize, hey, this is kind of a fun meal. This is this ramen is an experience, So it's great to see a story like this where the characters are appreciating life in a new way. And even watching Sosuke teaching Ponyo about the simplest things, like what does he say? Like everything that happens where they're like, is the water gonna turn on? And Sosuke's like, we have a tank in the back. Isn't that great? This is how things work. I'm learning about things, and now I can show you how things work. And Ponyo's just amazed about everything.
Yeah, they have a pretty good lock on how a 5-year-old's brain works.
Yeah. And so, but that it comes across as infectious, right? So it comes across to the audience. It's like, you get that recovery, that renewed sense of wonder. And also just, I really like the translation of the incorporation of the true love element, which is kind of boiled down into a friendship, just a true friendship kind of a thing. But it's just so sweet and innocently done that, and it's not like in your face. I still don't totally understand the whole test of the magician at the end, but they passed it, I guess. And you just feel good for them. You feel so happy.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an intense ask, isn't it? Because they do ask him like, "Hey, do you love her? And will you love her forever?" It's like really signing up for something real big there.
Yeah, but also, will you love her forever even if she's a fish?
Yeah, right. Good thing it was a 5-year-old kid and he couldn't think about it any deeper.
Yeah.
He's like, sure, that sounds good.
It brings a new element to the if you keep it, you have to take care of it reprimand.
Yeah, that's they're signing up that kid for a big responsibility. But also, I guess maybe they just need a rubber stamp to affect, because they just needed to either turn Ponyo back into a fish permanently or into a human permanently. But they needed to her being on the fence and being both was like destroying reality.
Yeah.
So they needed her to pick a lane. And so they needed, in a lot of ways, I kind of just view it as them finding a family that would be like take care of her.
And yet, in another way, it's almost a Shakespearean diplomatic marriage, which I was thinking, because, you know, Fujimoto's whole plan is humans have ruined the earth. They are the polluters, and we are going to return the earth to a more natural state. We're going to bring forth all of this life and generation that hasn't been seen since the prehistoric ages. And Ponyo's love for Sosuke and her, you know, for lack of a better term, like union with Sosuke is a meeting of the two kingdoms, of the Sea Kingdom and the Earth Kingdom, which is the polluters. And she basically saves the humans from being destroyed because she totally ruins Fujimoto's plan, because now she's united with the humans, which is, again, just like a whole other level that's not even addressed, but there's so many just randomly deep implications of the plot that's been set up.
Yeah. No. So some big, like, heavy decisions being made in this otherwise relatively lighthearted movie.
Yeah. But I do want to talk about the literary heritage of the story, because it comes from Miyazaki's reading of The Little Mermaid when he was a child, and he was really bothered by the fact that The Little Mermaid doesn't have a soul until, you know, she's united with the unless she can become united with the human, because that's not guaranteed in the original story. And yet there's also The Little Mermaid, which is inspired by the old German tale of Undine, and that's really interesting. I feel like I've already brought up Undine, but now this is where it kind of all comes in, because it's going to play into our next film too. But in Undine, there's a nymph who marries a human, and then the human goes back to, like, she's living in this cottage in a dark wood or whatever, and the human has braved lots of magical perils to and actually accidentally ends up there, finds her. They live a long time in kind of isolation, and they fall in love, and then and get married, and then they come back to where he was living, and his old love is suddenly gets super jealous, and then he starts falling in love with his old love, and then kind of starts to abandon Undine. But as a nymph, one of her things is, like, if she's been united with a human and he leaves, he has to die for that.
Obviously.
Obviously, which it plays into the original Little Mermaid story as well, where she has to kill the prince if he doesn't fall in love with her, which he doesn't, because she can't talk, and it's really hard to...
Let's see you animate that, Disney.
But anyway, so we have Undine translating into The Little Mermaid, translating into Ponyo. Also, the guy who wrote Undine, Friedrich de la Montfort, whatever.
Rolls off the tongue.
Yeah. He also is one of the first people to dramatize some of the old Icelandic tales, which then was adapted by, or was influenced Wagner to write The Ring Cycle, of which also is influenced in both The Lord of the Rings, takes a huge influence from The Ring Cycle, but also Ponyo takes a big influence.
Lord of the Rings takes influence from The Ring Cycle?
It's crazy, right?
Who could have saw it coming?
But apparently Miyazaki just listened to Die Valkyrie while writing the story, and I don't know, on repeat or something. But the story takes D Valkyrie.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
My
it
German's
looks like die,
terrible.
but it's just the. It's one of the gendered forms of the from the German language. So it's
Gotcha.
just the Valkyrie. Yeah, D Valkyrie.
So, but D Valkyrie is about a Valkyrie named a Valkyrie being basically an angel of sorts, who falls in love with a human and has to go down and I don't know, they have some adventures. I don't know if they get married because he's already in love with someone else. I think his sister. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in that story. But anyway, there's that whole union. But there are these motifs from Die Valkyrie that translate into a lot of other stories, which most famously is the Ride of the Valkyries, where she's coming down to Earth with all of her Valkyrie sisters, and it's this really epic march, which has been used in Apocalypse Now when they're napalming the town. It's been used so many times, but it's directly referenced here when Ponyo escapes for the second time, and all of her fish sisters turn into these golden giant fish, and she's like riding on them, and they almost completely reprise that number, but her name originally is Brunhilde, which is the name of the main Valkyrie in Die Valkyrie. So there's a lot of this fantasy cross-pollination happening amongst these stories. But again, this is a good example of taking a lot of those inspirations and modifying them enough to become a new story or to become a new kind of commentary or message, I guess.
Yeah. Man, did we just equate Ponyo to a Valkyrie?
We didn't. Miyazaki directly equated Ponyo to a Valkyrie.
I'm guessing she does have all of her little sisters, right? Who are I just make the assumption they're all sisters, but
They are.
They are constantly helping her out in varieties of ways.
Yeah.
Especially by screwing up Fujimoto.
Yeah. Oh, the other Django Unchained uses the Brunhilde story as a backdrop too. Anyway, I'm just saying that story permeates a lot. But so the other thing to mention about Ponyo before we move off it, in terms of the using the magic in the modern day, is like we talked about when we're talking about the idea of escapism, the idea of getting away from the evils of the real world. And one of the things that Tolkien was constantly trying to, for lack of a better term, escape through his fantasy was mechanization and roboticization. And he talks specifically about, if you write a story that doesn't have electric street lamps, maybe it's a commentary on how ugly and terrible electric street lamps are. And I feel like in Ponyo, we have not an escape from, but using magic as direct combat against the evils that Miyazaki is trying to escape, which is primarily pollution and environmental disrespect, which plays into a ton of Miyazaki's work. But here you have it specifically in Ponyo starts off by just getting captured by a glass bottle in a really dirty harbor in Japan. And also again, Fujimoto's whole plan is to rid the world of the pollution and bring back the sea life that's been lost through pollution. And so in that way, it's not an escape from the things that Miyazaki doesn't like about the modern world. It's not writing a world with no pollution. It's about writing the magic to come back and combat those evils of the modern world in a way that would kind of seem more futile or less impactful if it was done in a more straightforward, less magical way.
Yeah. No, the magic is a key part of it, right?
And I don't know what Fujimoto's whole story is. I don't know how he went from being a human to being a sea wizard.
He looks like he used to be on the Yellow Submarine back in the day. And
I was thinking he looks like
took
David
one too
Bowie.
many shrooms with the Beatles. And one of them turned out to be a magic one, a truly magic mushroom.
Yeah. And he does have the baby with the power, which is Ponyo.
He does have the baby with the power. Power of voodoo.
Hoodoo.
You do.
Oh.
Have we done Labyrinth on this show? We've done Labyrinth on this show.
We have done Labyrinth.
Yeah, that was on the Jim Henson episode, wasn't it?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, that's right. All right, shall we move on to Undine?
Yes, we shall.
Undine from 2020. Undine is a historian giving lectures on the history and future of Berlin to tourists. After Johannes tells her that she is ending his affair with her, she reminds him that if he leaves her, she must kill him, referring to the classic legend that she is named after. Johannes dismisses her, and later that day she meets Christoph, an industrial diver who attended one of her lectures. Soon a romance develops between them, and Christoph shows her some of the strange things he has seen on his dives, including a gigantic catfish and Undine's name written on a submerged bridge structure. When a work accident leaves Christoph in a coma, Undine must take drastic measures to put her past behind her for good and secure a future for the man she loves.
All right, I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this question. Did the German guy's voice, the diver's voice, sound really odd to you? It sounded really weird to me, and I couldn't tell. It almost sounded like he was talking like with cotton balls in his mouth. I couldn't tell if it was like an impediment or if he just had like a very distinct mumble, kind of like Tom Hardy-esque.
Well, he was speaking German, so I wasn't paying that much attention to whether or not he was pronunciating properly.
Ja, ich verstehe.
But he does look like he had a cleft palate or something, so there might be a little bit of an impediment.
Oh, yeah, maybe. I didn't notice that. Yeah.
He actually reminded me a lot of Joaquin Phoenix for some reason.
He does look like Joaquin Phoenix.
Okay,
I
good.
think it's the haircut. Yeah.
I think Joaquin Phoenix has a little bit of the curve of the lip in a similar way.
Yeah. He's the German Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah. He did a good job. I think both him and Paula Beer are both dancers originally who had worked with this director on a film previously, I think Transit, and he really liked that they had a very a more natural style of acting than some of the actors that came out of the German acting schools. And so he liked their chemistry a lot and recast them. Actually, I think he was working on this film, and then while finishing the previous film, he had them act out a scene. He just like threw out an improv situation for them and really liked their chemistry, and then recast them again for this film.
They did have really good chemistry for the romance portions of the film. It is mostly a romance movie.
It is.
Like the fairy tale kind of works its way into like this dark mystery version of a fairy tale, which fits with the Undine nymph who must kill all of her exes type tale.
Well, yeah, that's an extreme version. I think that's how the fairy tale has kind of translated, but it's really more a vengeance on a broken contract in the original.
Yeah. I like how Undine is just straight up about it too at the start of the movie. She's like, "Hey, dude,
I know.
If you leave me, I'm just letting you know I'm gonna have to kill you." And I don't think the guy really takes her seriously, but also you should have taken her seriously.
Yeah, and that's the only indication we get in this film that there is that history of this story within the story. Because she's like, in the story that I'm named after, blah, blah, blah. But then you get some hints that, maybe she was being metaphorical because later on she calls the other guy, what are their names? She calls Christoph and is like, I thought I couldn't live without him. And but now I realize that I can, and we can have a beautiful life together or whatever. And so... But then you realize, oh no, she was actually being literal.
Yeah. It's honestly, the fantasy's kind of like the lead is buried, but once you start to get into it, you're like, oh, okay, no, there's definitely something weird going on here. I came away with the impression that she was actually like either immortal or very long lived as a mermaid water nymph thing. Mm-hmm. I thought like the reason she was so good at like giving the historical presentations was that she had been there for a huge chunk of the history of Berlin, and so could more easily give the history that, and she just seems, I don't know, weirdly unkillable, But
Yeah. So I watched an interview with the director that shed some light on that. But I do want to talk about how well I think the fantasy elements are integrated. Like you're saying, they're pretty subtle. They're not necessarily in the background, but they kind of hide in the shadows of the film, if that makes sense. And so you're constantly kind of seeing them peek out, and you're not sure how much the film is taking them seriously or just trying to make you think that it's taking it seriously until you finally get to pretty much the very end. So I think the other thing that's really great, especially talking about medium, talking about style, is that this film is, especially compared to something like The Red Shoes, this is a very hyper realistically portrayed type film. It has a very indie kind of a feel to it.
yes, very much so. Yeah.
And it's super
the
simple.
Hyper limited cast, the hyper limited locations.
Yeah. It's super simple. Again, the actors have a very kind of natural quality to them. And so I think that all lends itself very well to contrasting the fantastic elements with, and then making them feel more integrated into the real world too, because they're not over the top. They're not, there's no sea wizard making giant glowing jellyfish or whatever. But, there's like a giant catfish that sometimes shows up in weird places. And
What's his? They give him a name, don't they? It's like Big Fred or something.
Gunther.
Big Gunther.
It's a very German kind of thing, I feel like. And then I looked up, there are catfish that big. That was not an exaggeration.
Yeah, no, catfish get
That is horrifying.
huge.
Not that catfish are, I assume they're not that. I mean, they can bite and stuff, but it's just that's a big fish.
Yeah, that's a big old fish. Make up some catfish jambalaya with that.
So in terms of Undine's lore, I guess, specifically the character in this film, there's a big part of the theme of the film, which is this receding or drying up, which is both a physical phenomenon in terms of the way that a lot of Undine's presentations about Berlin are the ways that they reroute the canals, and they're physically rerouting the water out of the city in order to build the city up, make it bigger and bigger.
Yeah, because it was in a marsh.
Right, which is another really important line from the film, which is that Berlin means marsh or swamp, or it could also be interpreted as a dry place in the marsh. And so what the director was talking about in the interview is that there's this idea of like you kind of mentioned, the dark waters. There's the dark sea that's kind of the mystical dark wood, or the where the unknown, where the fantasy elements live, but they're all being pushed out by modernity and dried up.
The clearing out of the fairy forest.
Yeah. And so in a subtle way, Undine has kind of been displaced. And so now she has to find a place in the real world. So now she takes a normal job and that kind of stuff. But she still has this kind of heritage that she has to be true to. And so there's all that kind of in the background. And so that's why I feel like in this film, talking about the magic elements, this is magic as eulogy. This is incorporating magic into the real world as kind of a swan song to those elements of wonder that are being pushed out by modernization and science and all that kind of stuff. And yet it's still kind of there. And there's still, if you go into the right pond, if you go deep enough, you still just might encounter the dark waters or Big Gunther or Undine.
I mean, it makes sense from a historical perspective. The Dark Ages, where a lot of these fairy tales kind of originate from, it also matches up with a period of history, especially in Europe, where a huge chunk of the primeval forest were cleared. like Europe used to be mostly forest, and like 80% of those forests were cut down between the fall of the Roman Empire and the year 1000. So that's also when most of these fairy tales originate from, when modernity was encroaching on those wild places. So that as an origin for fairy tales makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then, but for the most part, we're seeing this pretty traditional romance, like you mentioned. It almost has, like we mentioned just before we started recording, this this French angsty kind of romance element to it, especially with the kind of sort of love triangle, the super vague relationship between Undine and Johannes, the first guy, which I think the deal is that he was married and having an affair with her, but it also kind of sounded like he left her for someone else that was newer. I don't know. I was a little confused. But
yeah, it's never super duper clear. We just know that there's some other established relationship that he's kind of like in and out of, and he's kind of like, I don't know. Undine seemed to be the side piece to me. Yeah. I think Undine also seems to have an awareness especially by the end of the movie, that as someone who is obligated to kill all of her exes, it's maybe a little bit responsible to go around dating.
I think the idea is more if you abandon her, right? It's more the and if you take it to like a more metaphysical type of realm, like if you attach yourself and bind yourself to the mythical, you better respect it, because it might come back to you.
Well, in the end too, she kind of like makes a bit of a noble sacrifice by abandoning the diver dude in order.
Right, and that's why he doesn't die, because he didn't leave her.
Yeah, it was the other way around. And in a lot of ways, she kind of becomes like a protective spirit, giving them like that totem at the end. Like that very much feels like, oh, we have a water nymph who watches over our family, refuses to let any harm come to us.
Right.
Like,
you could almost make
dope.
a really interesting sequel about the child, and their like relationship with the waters and that kind of thing.
I mean, when the diver went back down a second time to work on the bridge that he had the accident on, it definitely seemed like Undine was there, like watching over him in a very kind of protective manner. Not just to say hi, but like, hey, if anything happened to you down here, I would not be okay with it. So I am here to keep an eye on you and make sure that you're not going to die. Sorry, bud, you've got a protective deity now.
It does also seem like that particular spot is, her spot, or the spot where her and so another thing to mention about the original story is that Undine has an uncle who's basically like a Neptune.
His name Big Gunther?
I don't think it was Gunther, because that's a silly name and I would probably remember that. But Undine has an uncle who's like almost like a Neptune kind of a character. He takes the form of rivers that kind of guide the night through the wood. He at some point is upset, and so he surrounds the cottage with water. And so he's very protective of Undine, and she has to talk him into letting her marry the human. And presumably he gives her the lecture about, if you marry him, you'll become human. You either have to become sea foam or kill him if he abandons you, yada, yada, yada. And so I feel like that's what Big Gunther is. Big Gunther is Undine's watcher, protector, because when they go down together, she, rides off with the catfish. And so the catfish is kind of her protector, and then she's there to kind of, like you said, protect him from her protector and be that in-between kind of person.
Watch out for Big Gunther. That's all I'm saying.
Watch out.
Big Gunther will get you.
Yeah, but there is also just the way that the film starts in media res gives you also this kind of sense of mystery, because there is no, like you said, she feels like a timeless being, even though you'd think she would learn by now to not get attached. But the fact that she has no backstory or origin or exposition within the film gives her character more of a mythical quality too, because and then she disappears and no one knows where she is. There's no kind of record of her even within the story, so that there is kind of a jumping into things and leaving the audience hanging or trying to pick up the pieces as they go along, but that is also part of that subtly mythical element of the film.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Man, I'm still thinking about Big Gunter. He's pretty cool.
I'll get you a Big Gunter poster.
I mean, he's literally a big fish. He's kind of like the movie Big Fish.
I know. It definitely brought some Big Fish vibes.
And I just like that the lore is very unspecific, but it doesn't need to be very specific to work.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, and especially
what you need to know and not much else.
And I do kind of like the fact that Undine is it's a very classic fairy tale, but it hasn't been Disneyfied. The Little Mermaid's been Disneyfied, but this is kind of a different track that the audience isn't, completely expecting too much. So let's move on to overall notes and kind of talk about this idea in general of, and we've kind of been touching on this, but I'm really interested in how we bring this element of the mystical or the unknown into modern storytelling, because like we said, there's so much less of a space in the world for something that's not known, because everything is Googleable, everything has a Wikipedia page, blah 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 blah. Like I was reading last night in a book of Irish fairy tales about the puka, which is, there has been a modern adaptation of the puka in Harvey, which I think is a really great film. Again, talking about just kind of this pure friendship between the human world and the fairy world, but some of the original stories of the puka was a horse that would kind of, it would come up to travelers who were out drinking too late or gambling or whatever, and on their way home, it would pick them up on its back, and then they would be stuck on its back, and it would just take off mad dash, run them against walls and scrape and break their shins, and then through brambles and tear up their clothes, and then like pretend to throw them off a cliff so that they're terrified to death, and then run them back, and then just kick them off on the side of the road. And then, they would get home late and they would be totally beat up and whatever. And so you get this sense that, in a world where your cottage is a few miles away from the tavern, the guy goes out drinking, he's coming back late, there's no lights, your mind's going to come up with all kinds of stuff out there. And then also, if you have to come up with an explanation to your wife by the time you get home of why, you might have fallen down a path or a hill, there's a room for this kind of mythical explanation. And also, with a lot of these, like the puka has so many different spellings because there's no consistency, because it kind of pops up in different ways. Sometimes it's a horse, sometimes it's a bull, sometimes it's a rabbit. And so there is this sense that you can feel with, that Tolkien was feeling, that a lot of these fantasy writers are feeling, that now you have electric streetlights. There's no room for a mythical explanation because everything is in the light. Everything has been explored or explained or whatever. And there's a much different space for fireside storytelling, if any. Again, like we talked about with parlor stories and fairy tales. And so it's interesting to think about where there is a place, or if there is a place, or how that element can still be incorporated into modern stories.
Yeah. How do you blend the more modern, contemporary setting that's farther and farther away from the deep, mysterious force of antiquity with the fairy tales that represent those deep forests of antiquity? Where are the mysterious places left?
Except for the dark web.
Oh, hopefully not there.
Yeah, there's really not a great... There might be a little bit of room for it in a technological sense, almost in a Black Mirror-y kind of a way, but I feel like either of those applications are super limited, or they have not been they've not been well explored, because even with specifically Black Mirror, the stories become a little one note, right? There's kind of one thing to say about that, which is the technology can take over too much, and then there's not enough left in the real world. But it's not really the same kind of a feeling as a mythical story.
I think the best place to set your unexplored fairy tales is space.
Is that sarcastic?
No, I think that represents the unexplored, the mysterious, the thing that could contain the mystical beings that go bump in the night. It's near because of modernity, but it's also still pretty far away from modernity. I think it could be the place where we keep the fairy tales of the future.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, I'm trying to think of how that has been or could be done. It's kind of been done. Star Trek. Yeah, that's true. Star Trek has done that really well.
Star Wars. Actually, both of them are kind of like space fairy tales.
Yeah. That's true, because they do lean more on the fantasy end than hard sci-fi doesn't give the same impression. I guess you do get that in 2001 and things of that nature. Yeah, I can see that. Even Planet of the Apes.
Star Wars literally starts off a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
It is
once upon a time in a land far, far away. I'm just saying, Star Wars is Space Trek. Come at me, Star Wars stands. Do it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that's a good place to look towards.
To boldly go.
And then, yeah, there are a lot more films, I feel like, in the further watching category of this episode. So I've already mentioned Harvey, which I think is a great place to find modern fantasy intersection in a very wholesome and just feel good type of film. There's also The Secret of Rowan Inish from 1994, which is about the Selkies. We didn't talk about too many specifically Irish fairy tales in this series, but we also talked about Song of the Sea in a previous episode, which is also a very actually Song of the Sea and Wolfwalkers. A lot of the oh gosh, what are they called? Cartoon Saloon stories kind of fit this type of storytelling. Undine from 2009, starring Colin Farrell, is Undine, I think, set in Ireland or Scotland, and it's another modern take on this same story. Black Swan from 2010 has a lot of similarities to The Red Shoes in a very dark take. The Lure from 2015 is also a very dark take on The Little Mermaid, as is Creature from the Black Lagoon from 1954 and The Shape of Water from 2017. And then, as we mentioned, a lot of Ghibli films kind of find their grounding in this intersection of a modern Japanese setting with a lot of fantasy, fairy tale, folk tale influence. So My Neighbor Totoro is a really good to go hand in hand with Ponyo. They both have that kind of fun, wide-eyed wonder at the world with some magical elements.
Yeah. Man, there's so much fun stuff out there.
There's a lot of fun stuff out there. And yeah, so I guess as a whole, we have kind of wrapped up a big chunk of what fairy tales are. Obviously, there's a lot of other types of fairy tale films out there. And again, we're trying to kind of stick to a track, kind of not go too much into the super sensationally type of fairy tale films, but there are all kinds of fairy tale influenced stories out there should you choose to go check them out. A few that are coming up. There's one that I just saw a trailer for today called Damsel that's coming out next year, starring Millie Bobby Brown, which looks like a high fantasy kingdoms collide, twist on the damsel in distress. The princess has to go fight a dragon. I don't know. And a film called Wildwood, that the brief premise that I saw, I don't know when that's coming out, but brief premise seems very fairy tale-y, dark woodsy kind of a thing. So keep an eye out, because there's fairy tales still coming out. They're still a thing, but hopefully this gives some categories for how to think about fairy tales, how to think about the lineage of fairy tales, where they're coming from, and how they are approaching the stories and the types of things that they're trying to say about the real world. Because just taking a fairy tale that you made 50 years ago and remaking it is not as interesting as taking a fairy tale that no one knows about and using it to make a comment on how we live in a modern technological world.
Who knows? There might be a fairy tale right in your neck of the woods, just waiting for you to discover it.
Yep. All right. Well, that'll wrap up fairy tales, and that will wrap up 2023. Thank you all for joining us. And we have got some new stuff lined up for next year, next season. But yeah, we are coming back with a new series in January. We'll be taking the break in December for holidays and whatnot. And in January, we will be talking all about the French New Wave. Alex, give us a little more detail on what's coming up with French New Wave.
All right. So for the French New Wave course, we're going to call it something along the lines of Cahiers du Cinéma, which is the magazine that kind of represents the centralization of this movement. The film critics and writers who became filmmakers in their own right and contributed to this movement, who watched all those old Hollywood movies and kind of gained new appreciations for techniques that were used, and also in the process kind of invented the idea of indie cinema along the way. But we'll be talking about Jean-Luc Godard in detail, who we surprisingly have not done an episode on yet. Eric Romer and his 6 Moral Tales. Francois Truffaut, who's appeared many times in this podcast, but we've never done a specific topic on him. Claude Chabrol, who is a very good French New Wave filmmaker, but probably not one of the names that a layperson might be super familiar with, unless you get really into this kind of nerdy stuff. And finally, Jacques Rivette, again, kind of the same idea. So we'll be kind of following those 5 creators, as well as kind of following their careers through the French New Wave as it kind of built up and culminated in around 1973. Kind of starts in around 1960 and goes to 1973, so about a decade of very intense change in the film industry that happened all around the world, but the impetus is often placed on this group of filmmakers out of France who kind of created this new way of looking at cinema and breathed some new life into the world of cinema as it started to stagnate in the post-World War II decades. Yeah. I just realized there's going to be a lot of throwbacks to Hitchcock through these guys too. Yeah, all these guys are Hitchcock nerds. All these guys are nerds about all of the old, like Howard Hawks and Orson Welles and all of the classic directors whose works were probably enjoyed in their own time, but not thought of in the way that they're currently thought of. And if you don't have these guys, then you don't have Scorsese.
Yeah, that's true.
You don't have, name starts with a B.
Coppola.
You definitely don't have Coppola. You don't have any of the American film greats. You don't have Wes Anderson. You don't have Christopher Nolan. Man, what's his name? Oh, he did all the writing we did an episode on him. Paper Moon.
Oh, Bogdanovich. Yeah,
Bogdanovich.
for sure.
Yeah, you don't have Bogdanovich without these guys. You know, they not only did they change the way movies were made, but they changed the way movies were thought about.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you know, you hear them talked about a lot, but not in a lot of depth. So if you're interested in that and kind of going into the careers of these people and not just their movies, but the impetus behind them and how they influenced each other and how they influenced future movies that came after them, then this should be a pretty interesting series for you. And also, if you like watching movies with subtitles, you will enjoy this.
Yeah, I was gonna say if this sounds interesting to you, this would be a great time to get a subscription to the Criterion channel, because probably every one of these films will be on there.
Oh, like I guarantee.
Yeah.
If not everyone, then at least 90%.
Not a sponsor, but we're totally open to that.
Anyway, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 480 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlinks.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us at The Filmlings.
Summaries for this week's episode were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can discover everything I do at thebluejayproject.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. He did a good job. I think him and both him and Paula Beer are both actresses. They're.
You'll get there. You'll figure it out. What's going on here, man?
I think him and Paula Beer, the lead woman, are both dancers.
Anyway, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you see, this is what happens if I don't actually read it.
Dude, you jumped like 6 lines ahead.
I didn't have the tab open, so I was like trying to do it from memory. Okay. Not like we haven't said it 150 some odd times.
Yeah.